Solar is having a paradox moment. Deployment is hitting record highs. And yet, the business environment has arguably never felt more volatile. In the last year alone, we've seen curtailment and grid bottlenecks reshape project economics, investors retreating to safer assets, and markets diverge sharply. The Middle East accelerating at breakneck speed, while parts of the US and Europe wrestle with congestion, pricing pressure, and permitting uncertainty. Which raises a provocative question. Is standalone solar still a viable project? Or is it becoming something that market has already moved past? Which raises a provocative question. Is standalone solar still a viable product? Or is it becoming something that the market has already moved past? To unpack that, I'm joined by Peter Pongracz, host of Soliverse and senior sales strategist who spent 14 years scaling SaaS businesses globally in solar and beyond. Peter has built high-performance sales teams, driven multi-year growth, and worked closely with developers and EPCs and asset owners across regions, which gives him a sharp lens on what the market is actually buying and why. Peter, welcome to What Matters. Let's start with your story. For listeners who don't actually know you, can you introduce yourself, what Soliverse is, and what you spend most of your time focused on today?
For sure, and thanks for having me. So it's actually interesting to be on this side of the microphone right now. But maybe let me take you back to the days when I joined Solar about 5 years ago. So by trade, I'm a sales guy and a sales consultant. So I've been building and scaling sales teams across multiple industries. But the common theme was always software or SaaS. And about 5 years ago, I actually joined Solar 24/7 more or less, and I was actually looking for some materials to quickly get myself up and running in the topic and really dive deep into what actually matters in terms of the solar business. And I started listening to a couple of podcasts, one of them being the Solar Mavericks podcast, and I still listen to Benoit every single week almost, but I thought to myself, okay, this is something that we could use some version of in Europe as well. And it was an eye-opener of thinking about it for a year and then actually leaving my job and doing the podcast full time. So it's quite a change, and I thought that it's going to be interesting to bring all those business stories to solar and the broader renewable space as well. So that was kind of my entry to the whole solar game, but it's been a hell of a ride ever since.
That's really interesting, because really when someone decides to start a media platform in a crowded space, it usually means that they felt something important wasn't being said, I guess.
Yeah, indeed. And, I'm quite passionate about business and entrepreneurship in general. And what I saw missing was mostly talking about, the business stories, the scaling, the business cases, the policy, everything that underpins this whole business model of global solar. I felt that I could at least I will try to do a good job at it. And, we are at episode 38 right now. So it's been quite a ride, and I'm enjoying every episode ever since.
Yeah, that's really the reason I'm excited to have you on the show, because you're not just watching solar from the sidelines, you're actually listening to what the market is saying in real time. So you hear developers, investors, and what teams are really saying.
Indeed, and that's a good trigger question to maybe coming back to last year, right? So 2025 was quite tough in solar, both in terms of politics, geopolitics, markets, all of these developments that are happening every single week. So the solar coaster is at full swing. But what has been interesting is that although we see some slowing down in the West, so in terms of US, Europe, and other markets as well, you kind of see it's like a keyboard of the piano, right? So if you press one button, the other one pops up, and that's, I think, the best analogy to use. So some new markets have emerged, for example, the Middle East, Saudi, United Arab Emirates, and also we see quite a lot of activity in Southeast Asia as well. So it's nice to see, and it's definitely an interesting ride.
For sure. So let's start by that, this sort of paradox, and maybe we can zoom out a little globally and then dive deeper later. So as you say, markets are really diverging very fast. And in the Middle East, especially, we're seeing this acceleration, while parts of the US and Europe are a little more under pressure. What do you think is driving this divergence?
I would say the first and foremost driver would be policy. So clear guidelines, clear rules for the development of solar, and also BESS as well, which we can dive into a little bit deeper. But I think if you have the political support and clear guidelines, then it's going faster. Here in Europe, we like to regulate things quite early on, and in the US, we don't really need to talk much more about the current administration and, the big beautiful bill, etc. But I think it's a clear signal to the market that an oil-producing country is going to be producing more renewable-based energy than oil-based energy in probably this year or maybe next year. So it's an absolute game changer, in my opinion.
And so Going again into the global installations, we're still seeing that the global installations are growing, but yet we're talking about developers that would describe last year as a chaos. So, we've seen more price pressure, more curtailments, grid constraints. How do these two realities coexist?
Well, I mean, the three keywords I would put forward, and these are not my words, but mostly from Solar Power Europe, is flexibility, BESS, and the grid. So these are the three components that we need to manage. So, and those also tie into curtailments as well. But as the grid gets a little bit more saturated, as more solar is being produced, we clearly see the use case for BESS and large scale BESS to stabilize the grid and help the grid out when you see these huge peaks in the duck curve. This year we've seen a lot of negative hours in Germany in the summer, and I think this year is going to be even worse, or actually more significant. And I think batteries are probably the best solution that we can bridge this gap with. And the first clear indication is also that Solar Power Europe actually has built a battery platform, so a battery Europe platform, which they launched 2 weeks ago, and that gives significance to how important batteries are this year and the years to come.
For sure. I did want us to dive into batteries. We also, let's do that in a little bit. You also mentioned grid connection, and we know that it really is becoming a defining constraint in many markets. How do you see the curtailments and congestion changing the way developers think about project economics?
Well, of course, it introduces a new element of uncertainty, right? So if they are trying to put up all of these capex up front with the high interest rates, etc., it's quite a gamble. So what we really see in terms of projects is both in terms of the early stage and later stages as well, that the standalone kind of solar project is almost dead in most markets. So you still have a few here and there, but the biggest use cases or the most kind of sexy projects are the ones with hybrid technology, right? So either have hybrid solar plus BESS, solar plus wind plus BESS, or any combination thereof. And, of course, investors are also valuing these type of projects a little bit higher with their investment. And on the other hand, there still seems to be a huge flight to safety. So you see the projects which, although are producing lower yield and lower return, people would rather go for that because it's guaranteed, as opposed to something that's still risky, with no grid connection, no PPA whatsoever. So it's a clear flight to safety across the board.
Yeah, definitely agree. It feels like there's that flight to safety happening in the industry right now, where I guess capital is more cautious and risk tolerance is lower. From your perspective, where are you seeing that show up most clearly?
Well, in terms of risk management, you see that the financing of the earlier stage projects is getting a little bit more difficult, and then both investors and developers are doing more and more due diligence. So they are trying to make sure that, once they invest into a project, they actually have a realistic chance of being able to deliver on that project. And, we can bring up a couple of examples. For example, in Germany, just the paperwork can take you between 6 to 12 months, some cases, and in Romania, I just spoken to a developer friend of mine about a month ago, and there you can get everything done within 30 to 60 days. So as long as that doesn't change, and also the addition of BESS to a standalone solar project is also possible even within the development process already. So you have filed all the paperwork, you have applied for the permits, etc., and then you realize that you could use BESS to complement your project, and they are quite susceptible to that. So that's a very positive news. And I've seen some news recently that there is going to be more and more money dedicated to, reducing the capex as well, both on a European level and the member state level. So those are the positive news. Now it's just time for execution.
For sure. And if we look at the earliest decisions, how much of the risk would you say is actually decided in the site selection stage?
Well, I mean, site selection is obviously critical because especially in Europe, all the good land is gone. So now we only have, class B or quite complicated land where you need to kind of think about the system design from the get-go, because it's either quite hilly terrain, rocky, etc. You have some limitations, for example, in Italy with the agri-PV legislation as well, that you can't really put large-scale, utility-scale projects out without on arable land. So that's quite a pressure as well. So, I see people and developers are being a little bit more careful. So they do more due diligence at an earlier stage and they try to mitigate the risk. In the US, I don't have so much insight, but still, in the middle of America, you have all that flat land that's easy to build on. So it's a little bit easier for them. But then on the other hand, you have how many counties in the US? I think it's in the thousands. So to get, to comply with the local legislation and to get the stakeholders buy-in, that's quite a challenge.
For sure. And as we talked before as well, we also have another risk amplifier of which is the grid.
Indeed.
Great. So you also mentioned, it's already come up a few times, flexibility. And we know that it's become one of the most important words in the industry right now. So in practical terms, what does flexibility actually mean? And why is it suddenly the currency of power markets?
Good question. So flexibility means that you are able to meet the demand in a little bit more flexible manner. So that also can come from BESS or it can come from the grid. So you are able to react to the needs of the grid and of the market a little bit faster. And it's one of the keywords and the key drivers of BESS as well, that we've realized that also due to the technological advancements on the BESS side, that every single month we have a new breakthrough, the bigger density, more duration type of BESS. I'm not an expert on the technology side of BESS, but basically it's clearly showing that new and new applications are opening up every single day or week. And then those applications are also translating into a little bit more flexible projects as well.
And so I guess if flexibility is the currency, then I guess batteries would be the bank?
Most probably, yes. Most probably. And you can clearly see the data from Solar Power Europe shows that at least on the European level, the target is 10x by 2030. So that's going to be a huge lift. And we really need to buckle down and focus on, rolling those projects out. But I think it's possible. And also with the advancements, of all the technology, it's going to be much, much easier every single year.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that solar really hasn't slowed down. I mean, in fact, I think it's globally installing more than ever. But now we're looking at the different types of projects. So that's where the changes is happening. So related, we're hearing a lot a provocative phrase, which is a standalone solar is dead. When you hear that, what do you think it really means, and what's replacing it? We've talked a lot about batteries, but is it really dead or only in certain markets?
It could be certain markets, but across the board, definitely it has lost its allure, right? So you see more hybrid projects being built. Those are commanding higher premiums. And obviously, if the developer is looking at a higher return, then most probably they will be looking at a BESS coupled project if the situation allows it, of course. So it's quite an interesting use case. And I think the trend is clearly going to continue in the upcoming years.
Yes, definitely. I couldn't agree more. Again, looking back at some of the storage, is there other projects or places where the solar projects can still win without storage?
I think there are, but it's going to be the minority for sure. So if you apply the 80-20 rule, then definitely it's only the 20% that's going to make the cut. And also it depends a little bit on the market as well, because we've seen some huge projects being built in Central Asia as well recently. So I just spoke to a developer the other day who were working on a 600 megawatt, one plot project, which is crazy, at least outside of China, right? It's a huge project, and you clearly see that the economics are making sense. So the modules have gotten cheap enough. The whole rollout has gotten cheap enough for it to make sense in most countries across the globe.
You're saying economics is sort of keeping up, but would you say policy is keeping up, or is it lagging?
Policy is typically lagging behind, and there are some great ideas in different markets. In Europe as well, we tend to be a little bit slower in response, but there are some great initiatives. Now the challenge is going to be execution. So we have some great support from the European Commission as well to roll out those projects faster, better, and at least since the coming back to the geopolitical game, kind of President Trump has helped us a little bit to wake up in Europe. And then we've gotten a lot more political backing of, not just energy security, but also geopolitical security as well. So you've seen much more willingness from the policymakers to support solar and support energy production, because they realize that it's a key strategic asset without which we can't function simply. And we are electrifying the whole grid, we are electrifying transport, etc. We just need more energy. Period. That's the bottom line. And whether you like it or not, solar is the cheapest source of energy there is, so it makes sense.
Yeah. To me, it's almost like solar has entered its sort of grown-up phase, where the scale is assumed, but now we're talking more resilience, and that's where resilient becomes the differentiator.
On the geopolitics side, it's quite interesting to see the levels of reshoring of manufacturing, both in Europe and in the US, of course. In the US, it's a little bit more pressing at the moment, but in Europe as well. I just spoken to a dear friend of mine, Dr. Rado Kopesek from ISC Constance, and he's a legend in the solar manufacturing space. So he actually knows everything about modules, module technology, etc. The whole tendency seems to be that we are trying to bring back manufacturing of all the hardware products to Europe, at least to meet our own needs. We are never going to be able to export at a reasonable level in terms of price, but there is nothing stopping us from being able to produce 100 gigawatts of modules per year, scaled. So I think people are realizing that it's a combination of the economic future of the continent or continents. It's
funny, as you were saying security, it was just coming to me that security really has become a major theme, and it's not just energy security anymore, but also supply chain security. So it's funny that you mentioned this case, because I was going to ask you how do you see markets responding when it comes to manufacturing of modules, batteries, and the rest of the stack?
It's from what I hear, it's different reactions from different markets. So from the US, we clearly see, everything has to be reshored, everything has to be built in the US, everything has to be, and the tariffs are helping this use case, of course. But then on the flip side, it can actually cause, a non-competitive markets, right? So you are producing in kind of a bubble, and then you are actually not racing against the global competitors. And of course, the big elephant in the room is China. And I think the main question is, how do you approach it, right? So from a European perspective, we are kind of in between. So we will want to do some domestic manufacturing. We will probably have to license some of the manufacturing technology back to Europe, so we are able to do some meaningful scaled manufacturing. But some aspects are clearly working already. So in terms of inverters, we are making some inverters in Europe already, and that's growing quite fast. So I think there is nothing in the way to be able to replicate the same model and move on to modules as well.
Do you think the policies, going back to policies again, do you think the policies will keep up as well on this new trend?
Hard to say. I think there is definitely more support between last year and this year, so it's a huge step forward. But again, execution, we are not the best at execution in Europe, so we really need to step it up, and we need to kind of find our way of fit it in our European model. So we can't be copying what the US is doing, what China is doing, but we definitely need to find our own way and our own kind of formulation of how this manufacturing and how this reshoring can come back to Europe.
I couldn't agree more. Now, if you had to speak the pain of the industry right now, specifically, let's move on to sort of solar software and the workflow perspective. What would you say is the biggest problem for teams that are still trying to solve? And what would you say is the smartest way they can respond?
So definitely there are quite a lot of challenges, and as you can appreciate, the solar market or the solar design market is quite fragmented. So you have the utility scale, you have the CNI market. Residential has taken a huge hit between last year and this year, but I think it's going to bounce back with time for sure. And in my opinion, the biggest challenge is that we need to eliminate monopolies. So for example, when we are looking at the yield simulation, right, PV-Syst is clearly a monopoly, and it was a good solution 20 years ago, but it needs to become much more up to date, and it needs to become much more collaborative. So also from the bankability's perspective, the project need to have alternatives such as PV case, such as rated power, such as other solutions that are providing a meaningful yield simulation that the banks should actually accept. I think that's clearly an indication of where the industry is going. And from my perspective, the trend is also moving into the cloud. So cloud computing everything AI, etc. We will still be using AutoCAD for probably a long time because it's what people are used to, right? But I think the time will come when a solution like Helioscope is going to be even suitable for the large scale utility scale side of projects. And I think that's going to change the market completely, because the more you reduce the barrier to entry, and which now is, AutoCAD knowledge, because it's not the most user-friendly software, I think the easier it will be to get all those new people in the solar industry and getting them performant, right? So it's not going to be just all the old guys who have 5-10 years of experience and are able to work with the software, but make it a much more user-friendly. And the second thing that I hear from the industry is there's no gold standard, right? So there's no end-to-end workflow so far in the industry where you would be able to prospect your land, you would be able to design your land, bring it to production, and maybe a little bit on the O&M side as well. And I think this is comprised of two parts. The first one would be that the industry should somehow agree on an accepted way of doing projects, which is going to be challenging, right? Every company is following their own kind of design. And the other thing is that the projects will need to be or should be covered in one continuous flow, because the more you import-export different pieces of data and different pieces of design, the more prone you are to errors, the more issues there might be with integrations, etc. So the more you can keep it in one continuous flow, the better it will become.
100%. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So it's funny that you mentioned the gold standard. How do you feel the people that you talk to, how do they respond to being more open to new players? For example, the yield simulation that you were mentioning. Because it feels like everybody sort of talks about this topic, but then, it's year after year, we keep coming up with the same blockers where PV systems to be the big player and no other solutions are accepted.
It is still the game, and there was an independent study done that compared PVSys to the other yield simulation tools, and it actually came out the second most distant from a realistic production number. So that clearly shows that it's quite problematic when you are working in a vacuum and when you have monopolies. I think there are some great tools out there. There is PVKs, there is a Plant Predict. There are some great tools which should be used. Now the question is, how do you break the barrier of bankability, right? Because this is the key word. Nobody is going to sign off on your projects unless it's bankable. So that's the most important thing to fix, and that's the holy grail.
Exactly, the holy grail. Need to figure out how to write a new holy grail. You were chatting about CAD, and from your perspective, like we say, it's probably another few more years before CAD actually sort of starts to move out of the usual solar design workflows. From your perspective, do you think it will be driven by new generations or coming in and wanting to use more services on the cloud, or what do you think will finally end up driving that shift towards more web solutions?
I mean, the clear tendency is the cloud, right? Any software is moving to the cloud because of, AI, because of cloud computing, because of economies of scale. So that's a clear tendency in every single software. Now, in solar, we are a little bit, how would I put it, old school, right? So we are set in our own ways, and unless there is some huge innovation that brings a tremendous amount of value or unlocks that value, we are not going to shift, right? So basically that is the challenge, to produce better solutions, to be able to onboard more people in the industry, to be able to design better projects, and to be able to roll those projects out much better.
Yeah, I like how you distill that. In terms of you were saying, like one continuous solar workflow, where do you see the biggest issues or the biggest problems happening throughout that sort of solar ecosystem or solar workflow?
Okay, so that's a tough question, but let's try to dig into it from the beginning. So let's look at the site selection. So that's a big challenge, right? Because we need to combine different types of data. So we need to combine the geological data, we need to combine the Google Earth data, and we need to combine different aspects of grid connection, etc. So that is quite a big lift, right? So we need to, and of course we come down to markets and local and regional markets, which will break the pie down even into smaller crumbles, and it's going to be even more difficult in terms of management. So I think you can go two ways, right? The first way, if you would have political support and we would really streamline the site selection criteria from a regulatory perspective, it would be nice, but I don't think it's going to happen. So The other solution would be probably designing a very flexible tool that can be adjusted to different markets and different regions. So I think those are the kind of two possibilities in the toolbox.
Working in the past in other solo softwares and trying to adjust for all the permitting requirements for all the, for example, just speaking US only, all the thousands of AHJs and all of their different requirements, that was definitely a nightmare. And it feels like it should be an easy problem to solve, but it feels like we're lightning years away still.
Yeah, it's going to be a real challenge, but I think that we will find a solution eventually. It's just going to take a little bit of time.
So if you continue talking about, some of these fragmented workflows that you were saying, some of those could be solved, and some of the biggest problems that having all of these fragmented workflows, what are some of the biggest things that you think one continuous ecosystem would provide?
So basically, if you would manage to make the whole workflow a bit easier to move, so you can shift that project across from site selection, let's move into solar design, right? So on the solar design side, you have the layout, you have the electrical part, before that you have the civil engineering. All of these aspects are quite tricky to manage, and typically you would have even different engineers designing different parts of the plant.
A lot of handoffs.
Indeed. And when it comes to, I think people are really prone to incentives. And if those incentives are clearly aligned, then great things are getting done. But if the incentives between two teams are getting a little bit more hazy and conflicting, I think it's going to be much more difficult to collaborate. You have the sales guys. I'm a sales guy. I've been a sales guy for 15 years. Your incentives are to sign the project, to sign the deal, and kick it on to the engineer who should figure out what he can do with it. So that's a huge challenge. And I think if those incentives are properly managed, at least on the company level, I think that can really unlock a lot of value. I
feel there's still every team kind of working in silos and not really having too much visibility into what the other ones are doing. So I think that's definitely one of the areas that could be solved with having that platform. What about data loss? There's a lot of hype around the data loss these days, and I think it's also related to what you're saying moving between different solutions and tools.
Yeah, I mean the data loss part is an obvious challenge, right? Like just looking at the US and Europe converting from the metric to the imperial system, you're already lost a little bit. But when it comes to moving that data and making small or larger errors, it can cause quite a lot of headache, both for the engineer and also then the EPC who is going to be on the ground and will be building those sites. I still feel like there is a huge unmet need between the design, so the digital representation of your project, versus the actual on-site reality. So I've been talking to a lot of people who have been in EPC for 20 plus years, and some things cannot really be solved unless you have a great owner's engineer on site who can actually take a walk through and check if everything is done properly. So there are just some things that cannot really be solved or are not easily solved with software. So drones are a great technology that help us, without physically going to the site to have a realistic scan of what the terrain looks like. But let's say if a little tree grows in the middle of the road or something like that, that will have some impact on our project.
And we hear a lot that 80% of projects never end up getting installed or never sort of end up seeing the light. Where do you think the problem is? Why is there such a big number of projects that never end up getting installed?
I actually have the answer to this. So at least from what I've heard. So most projects, if you have, let's say 100 applications and you have not much skin in the game, so if you don't need to commit capital at the application stage, this is causing huge issues in terms of the grid applications and blocking the queue, right? And then, of course, you need to look at it from the regulator's perspective as well. If you are the regulator, you should require the project developer to put up some capital, to have some skin in the game. Otherwise, we have situations like we have in Germany, for example, that you have, hundreds of applications, not too many high quality ones either. And then when it comes to the actual build out, by the time you actually jump through the hoops, you will have, as you mentioned, 80% loss of the potential project. So it's a difficult topic to to have a clear answer on. But I think the more vetting or the more reasonable vetting we can do as policymakers, I think that's going to help us, produce better projects and the right projects as well.
Thanks, Peter. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you, what's keeping you optimistic when the reality feels just so complex?
In space. That's the number one. So it's quite interesting, that it's only been popping up the last couple of months, but I think it's truly going to be the game changer application for most of the energy needs. Then, then we will have some logistical challenges of bringing that energy down or consuming it locally. But I think the latter is going to be a much more efficient way of doing it. But I think solar in space is going to solve a lot of challenges. And there are some very interesting prototypes out there already of solar space-bound modules, so for the application of space, which are kind of self-healing, which is quite an interesting way to look at things. And then, data centers in space and all of these topics, that Elon talked about in the last couple of months. I think he will 99% sure make it a reality, and then the rest will follow. So then the other countries and technologies will just follow. And then once we have a trailblazer showing you the road, I think that's going to be a quite interesting thing in your world.
Very interesting. I was definitely not expecting you for this to be the thing to keep you optimistic, but it's definitely something to look forward to. I definitely couldn't agree more. So thank you very much. This has really been a really good conversation, and I think a very needed reality check. What I would say is clear from this conversation to me is that solar is still scaling, but the rules of the game have changed, right? So now we've got flexibility and storage, which are becoming very central to project economics. And there's risk of market, but then success also comes down to disciplined site selection, realistic grid assumptions, and to building projects that actually can survive the market volatility.
Indeed. And, keep at it. The solar coaster is at full spin. So we will be able to ride it up as well, not just down. So I think we are quite resilient as an industry. The people love this underdog mentality of, being in renewables, being in solar. And I think if we keep grinding, we are going to succeed for sure.
Definitely. Before we wrap up, let's talk about the solar coaster, because again, you've been in the industry or around the industry for a while, and you're also talking to a lot of people. How are you seeing people sort of try to cope with this? How are they building this resilience? Because I think right now the word is resilience. How we be resilient, and we can sort of, as the roller coaster comes down, how do we come back up in a faster way?
So there are two types of people. The first one, the people who have been in the industry for a long time, so nothing really frazzles them anymore. They are just a different day, and we will ride out of it. If it's your fifth dip in the market, you're not going to panic. The people who have entered on the up market, it's going to be a bit more challenging, right? It's going to be a different reality check, but I think it can be called also a kind of natural cleansing mechanism of the market, that great companies, great projects will still persevere. And, the companies who weren't built on solid foundations, then they will disappear. But it's kind of the name of the game, and it's also going to be in every single industry as well. So I think people are generally optimistic looking into the future. We just need to keep at it, and we need to keep building more solar.
That's the key. Keep building more solar. Wonderful. So, Peter, for our listeners who want to connect or follow you, where can they find you?
So they are free. They are free to drop me a message on LinkedIn. So we can link to my LinkedIn in the show notes below, or they can just drop me an email at peter@soliverse.energy. So Soliverse is spelled SOLIVERSE, and energy we all know. But feel free to drop me a line or listen to the podcast. You can find me on YouTube and Buzzsprouts as well, so all the other outlets. But I really appreciate having you having me here, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Thanks, Peter. It's been a pleasure. And I do recommend our audience to follow Peter. He does have some really good guests and some really insightful conversations as well. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Anna. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening. What Matters is powered by PVKs, the platform trusted by solar professionals around the globe. If you never want to miss out on insights that keep solar projects moving forward, make sure you follow the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're interested in learning more about streamlining your solar project needs, visit pvks.com for more info. Until next time.